For Detective Laura Kane, there had always been something steady about working beside Ryan Cole. In a department that could be chaotic, political, and full of shifting loyalties, he had been a constant. They weren't partners by accident. Years back, when her old partner transferred to Vice, Ryan had been assigned to fill the seat in her unmarked car. The first week was all polite exchanges and cautious cooperation. By the third, they were finishing each other's sentences at briefings. By the end of that year, they could read each other's moves without speaking. It wasn't the kind of bond that came from friendship alone, though they were friends. It came from long nights parked on dimly lit streets, waiting for a suspect who never showed. From hours of canvassing neighborhoods where doors stayed closed, even when they knocked. From learning that the other wouldn't flinch in the moments that mattered, when the chase began, when a weapon flashed, when words turned to shouts. Ryan was methodical, the kind who organized his desk drawers and wrote legible notes in his case files. Laura was sharper at reading people, quicker to push when she thought someone was holding back. Together, they covered each other's blind spots. Their captain liked to say they were balanced, which in police work meant neither one was likely to get the other killed. That balance had carried them through drug busts, domestic standoffs, missing persons cases that ended in relief, and others that didn't. There was trust, too, the kind that wasn't just about survival. Laura knew Ryan wouldn't run to internal affairs over a mistake, and he knew she wouldn't undercut him in front of a superior. They had seen each other in moments of real vulnerability. The case that reminded Ryan too much of his cousin's unsolved murder, the late-night call Laura took outside the precinct when her brother Ethan was arrested for a bar fight. Neither of them ever asked for details they didn't want to give, but both knew the other would be there if the walls started closing in. Outside of work, they kept things light. A beer at O'Malley's after a long week, a running joke about who could eat the worst gas station food without getting sick. Ryan teased her about her coffee addiction. She ribbed him about his overpolished boots. It was a rhythm they didn't question. On the surface, Laura's life was simple enough. The job, her small apartment, occasional weekends with Ethan if he was keeping himself out of trouble. She didn't have the kind of personal entanglements that made some officers sloppy. At least, that was how it looked. Ryan, for his part, seemed to live for the work. He had an on-and-off relationship with a paramedic named Claire, but it was never the kind of drama that spilled into the squad room. His focus was always on the next case, the next lead, the next piece of the puzzle. Their days started early, with the same routine: coffee from the corner shop, a quick run-through of the overnight reports, and then the day's assignments. Sometimes they'd head straight to a scene. Other mornings were for follow-ups, interviews, paperwork, chasing loose ends. They were rarely surprised anymore, but they never stopped taking the work seriously. The spring that year had been busy. A string of burglaries on the east side had everyone stretched thin, and Laura and Ryan spent weeks tracking down leads that evaporated the second they got close. They closed the case eventually, but not without a few dead ends that left them both irritable. Still, they laughed about it on the way back to the precinct, the way you do when the job has wrung you out and you can't let it stick to you. Then came the morning when Ryan was called into the captain's office alone. It wasn't unusual for detectives to be pulled in separately for certain assignments, but something about the way the door stayed shut for so long made Laura curious. When he came out, he was unreadable. Not tense exactly, but there was a stillness in him that she recognized, the look he had when a case was too big to joke about. "Got something new?" she asked as he passed her desk. "Yeah," he said, glancing at the clock. "Might be a long one." She waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Just gathered a few folders, grabbed his jacket, and told her he'd catch up later. It happened a few more times over the next week. A phone call that sent him stepping outside. A file he kept separate from the rest on his desk. Late nights where she went home alone because he said he had a few things to finish up. She told herself it was probably just a federal case, something with enough confidentiality to keep him quiet. Still, it was odd for him not to share at least the broad strokes. On Friday, as they headed out to the parking lot, Ryan's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and said, "I've got to take this." His voice had that same clipped tone he used with certain informants, the ones who could spook if you let too much slip. She didn't press him. Not yet. But a part of her, The part that had learned to notice patterns in others long before they noticed them themselves, filed the moment away. They had been partners too long for her not to sense when something in the current had shifted. And whether Ryan meant to or not, he was starting to drift into deeper water without her. The Monday briefing was crowded. A cluster of detectives gathered around the long table in the incident room, coffee steaming in mismatched mugs. The whiteboard at the front was covered with names, dates, and addresses from half a dozen cases, the mess of handwriting layered over weeks of updates. Laura sat at her usual spot near the end, flipping through the new assignment sheets, half listening as the captain worked down the list. When Ryan's name came up, the captain's tone shifted, low but certain. "Cole, I want you to work this one quietly," he said, sliding a slim manila folder across the table. "We're looking at a mid-tier distribution network. Possible ties to a bigger crew we've been tracking with the feds. Keep it tight." Ryan nodded without comment, tucking the folder under his arm. It was the only case that morning that didn't get discussed in detail. The rest of the detectives moved on to their assignments, but Laura noticed the way Ryan avoided her eyes. By the time they were walking back to their desks, he was already on his phone, his voice low enough to blend into the background noise of the room. Over the next few days, Laura caught only glimpses of what he was working on. She saw him cross-checking financial records, sorting through surveillance photos, making notes in a smaller notebook he kept closed whenever she passed by. Once, she walked into the copy room and found him printing a series of addresses from an encrypted file. He stopped the printer mid-job and slipped the papers into the same manila folder. When she finally asked about it, he gave her the kind of half-answer that meant he was keeping the details locked down. "Just following a thread," he said. "Don't want to spook it." That thread, Laura would later learn, began with a pair of low-level arrests in the South District. Two men caught with a shipment of pills and enough cash to make it clear they weren't working alone. Under pressure, one of them mentioned a name that had been floating around narcotics for years: Victor Lasco. Lasco wasn't the kind of kingpin who made headlines. He stayed out of the spotlight, letting his network handle the risk while he collected the profits. Ryan's case wasn't to take Lasco down directly, but to unravel one of his supply chains and find the weak points. Ryan moved through it the way he handled most cases, step by step, no shortcuts. He pulled property records, dug into burner phone histories, and traced payments funneled through shell businesses. Every piece was another link in a chain that stretched further than most people realized. It was slow, meticulous work, the kind that demanded patience. Laura wasn't kept entirely in the dark. Ryan asked her to run a few license plates, make discreet inquiries about certain storage units. But the requests were specific and isolated, never enough for her to see the full picture. She chalked it up to procedure, though it wasn't how they usually operated. Normally, they shared everything, even scraps of information that didn't seem to matter at the time. Late one afternoon, as they drove back from interviewing a witness on another case, Ryan's phone buzzed with a text. He read it, his jaw tightening slightly, then slipped the phone back into his pocket without a word. "Everything good?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, glancing at the road ahead. "Just logistics." But his tone told her there was more. That night, Ryan stayed at the precinct after she left. He worked alone in one of the smaller interview rooms, the door shut, blinds drawn. The security cameras in the hall caught him making several calls, speaking in that same low voice he'd used before. He didn't leave until well after midnight. By the end of the week, Laura noticed a name in one of the case update emails, a name she hadn't heard in years: Ethan Kane. It was buried in a report about financial transactions flagged during an investigation. The surname jolted her for an instant before she reminded herself it wasn't exactly rare. Still, her pulse picked up. Ethan had been quiet lately, at least as far as she knew. Quiet didn't always mean clean. Ryan didn't mention the name to her. He didn't mention much of anything. But she began to suspect his case was intersecting with her own life in a way that was more than coincidence. At the time, she didn't push. Years of police work had taught her that people reveal what they want to when they're ready, and that asking too soon could make them close off entirely. She told herself it was better to let it play out. Still, she found herself watching him differently. The way he carried that folder everywhere, the way his expression shifted when certain calls came through. The job had made her fluent in reading tells, and Ryan was starting to show them. What she didn't know, not yet, was that his investigation was already closing in on a face she knew better than almost anyone. A face that belonged to family. The first crack in the wall came on a Wednesday evening, the kind of day that had dragged from the moment she clocked in. Most of the squad had already cleared out, the overhead lights in the bullpen casting that pale, flat glow that made the empty desks look even more abandoned. Laura was finishing up a report when she heard Ryan's voice coming from the hallway near the captain's office. It wasn't raised, but it carried that low, precise tone he used when the stakes were high. She didn't mean to linger, but his words were sharp enough to pull her attention. She recognized another voice, male, older, not from their precinct. She realized quickly it was one of the federal agents who had been in and out lately, the kind who never stayed long enough for small talk. Got confirmation on the transfers, Ryan was saying. The shell companies match, and the timeline's clean. I can tie the withdrawals directly to Ethan Kane. Laura froze. Her pen slipped from her fingers and rolled off the desk, hitting the floor with a hollow sound. She didn't move to pick it up. Are you sure? The agent asked. Positive, Ryan replied. It's him. And it's bigger than I thought. If I push on the right accounts, I can connect him straight to Lasco's distribution. She felt the blood drain from her face. Ethan's name had been in reports before, a parking ticket here, a petty misdemeanor there, but never like this. Never in the kind of conversation that came with federal involvement. Ryan's footsteps moved closer, and she quickly bent down to grab the pen, pretending to be deep in her paperwork when he walked past her desk. He gave her a brief nod on his way out, his phone already in hand. She didn't return the gesture. The rest of the night, she couldn't focus. The words kept replaying. Tie the withdrawals directly to Ethan Kane. Ethan had been trouble since they were teenagers. After their parents died, Laura had been the one to keep them afloat, juggling school and part-time jobs while Ethan bounced between questionable friends and worse decisions. She had covered for him more times than she could count. Unpaid fines, angry landlords, even the occasional visit from a patrol officer who recognized her name. But she had always believed he wasn't beyond saving. She told herself that the small lies she told on his behalf were temporary, a bridge to a time when he'd finally straighten out. And over the past year, he had seemed calmer. A steady job at an auto shop. Fewer calls in the middle of the night. Fewer unexplained absences. Now, if Ryan was right, all of that was just a layer of paint over something darker. When she left the precinct, the city air felt too sharp, like it was cutting into her lungs. She sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine, watching the streetlights flicker over the wet pavement. Her phone was in her hand before she realized she'd picked it up. She dialed Ethan. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. Laura? It's late. I need to see you, she said. Now. Yeah, now. His apartment was across town, a narrow one-bedroom over a corner store that always smelled faintly of fried food. When he opened the door, he looked older than the last time she'd seen him. Tired, maybe, or just worn thin. What's going on? He asked, stepping aside to let her in. She didn't bother sitting. I need you to tell me the truth about what you're into right now. No stories, no games. Just the truth. He frowned. Why? Because someone's looking at you, and they're not just local cops. This is serious. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. It's not what you think. I'm not the big fish here. I'm just helping move some things around. For someone who can make problems go away. Lasco, she asked. His eyes flickered, and that was enough. Ethan, she said, her voice dropping. Do you understand what kind of people you're dealing with? I know exactly what kind, he said quietly. That's why I can't just walk away. You think if Ryan, or whoever, makes this case, I'll just sit in prison? No. I'll be dead before the trial starts. You have no idea how fast they'll get to me. She felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. He wasn't scared in the way she wanted him to be. He was resigned. You have to stop talking to them, he said suddenly. If Ryan brings this in, he's not just killing me. He's killing himself, too. You think these people won't come after a cop who makes trouble? She didn't answer. On the drive home, her thoughts were jagged, colliding with each other before they could settle. She had trusted Ryan for years, trusted him with her life, but now his target was her brother. The case wasn't just another job. It was a fuse, already lit, and the only question was how far it had to burn before it exploded. By the time she pulled into her parking spot, the loyalty she had always believed unshakable was beginning to bend. She wasn't ready to admit it, not even to herself, but something inside her had already shifted. Laura didn't go straight to work the next morning. Instead, she drove to the edge of the city where the auto shop sat behind a chain-link fence. The place was already open, a couple of mechanics moving between bays, music playing low from a radio balanced on a tool chest. She spotted Ethan near the back, wiping his hands on a rag, his head bent over the engine of a pickup. He looked up when she approached, his eyes narrowing in a way that told her he already knew this wasn't a casual visit. "Not here," she said. He didn't argue. He set down the rag and followed her outside, around the corner to a quiet patch of asphalt where the hum of the shop faded to background noise. "You need to tell me everything," she said. "Not bits, not what you think I want to hear. All of it." He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "You already know most of it. I know you're working for people who'll kill you if they think you're a liability. I know Ryan's putting it together piece by piece. And I know that if you don't give me something, I can't help you." He studied her face like he was trying to decide if she meant that last part. "There's nothing to help with," he said finally. "I'm already in it. I've been in it for months. I handle transport, sometimes collections. I don't touch product. I don't meet the top guys. That's how I've stayed safe." Safe. She let the word hang there. "Ethan, you're on a list. You're in files. Ryan's not the kind of cop who looks away because it's messy." "Then you make him look away," he said flatly. She felt the weight of his words like a stone in her chest. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," he said. "He's your partner. If you don't slow him down, he'll get to me before I can get out. And once I'm in the system, it's over." For a long time, neither of them spoke. She could hear the faint rumble of traffic beyond the fence, the squeal of a wrench inside the shop. Ethan's face was calm, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Not fear, exactly, but something close to desperation. When she left, she didn't promise him anything. But the seed was there, and it stayed with her all the way to the precinct. Ryan was at his desk when she arrived, flipping through a stack of photographs. He glanced up and gave her a quick smile, the kind he used when he was already deep in thought. "You're early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, taking her seat. The day moved forward, but she found herself watching him more than usual. He was moving fast, chasing leads with a precision that made her uneasy. At lunch, he took a call and stepped outside. When he came back, there was a quiet satisfaction in his expression that told her he'd just confirmed something important. That afternoon, she tried her first subtle move. They were supposed to deliver a set of case files to the captain, but she held one back, a thin folder with addresses connected to Ethan's work. She told herself it was just buying time, that she wasn't sabotaging anything, just slowing the pace. Over the next few days, she repeated the pattern. Misfiled a report here, delayed a phone call there. It wasn't enough to derail the case, but it kept Ryan from closing the gap as quickly as he might have. She made sure it looked like routine errors, the kind every detective made when the workload piled up. But Ryan noticed. One evening, as they were packing up, he said, "You've been distracted lately." "Just tired," she replied. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether to press. "You know you can tell me if something's wrong," he said. She forced a smile. "I know." The next morning, he was out before she arrived, gone to follow up on a lead without telling her. That wasn't unusual for them, but it fed the uneasy rhythm between them. She started to feel like they were circling each other, both holding something back. That week, she saw Ethan again, this time at a diner just off the highway. He slid into the booth across from her, wearing a jacket that still smelled faintly of engine oil. "You're running out of time," he said. She stirred her coffee without looking up. "You need to keep your head down. No calls, no new jobs. Make it harder for him to pin anything on you." He leaned forward. "You're not hearing me. If he finds enough to arrest me, it won't matter where I am. You have to stop him before he gets there." She looked at him, really looked, and saw how far past the line he'd already gone. This wasn't the kid she'd grown up with, the one who'd called her from a payphone when he was scared. This was a man who'd made choices he couldn't take back. When she left the diner, her chest felt tight, her mind caught between two impossible loyalties. She had built her career on trust, the trust between her and Ryan, the trust between her and the badge. But blood was older than any oath. And for the first time, she didn't know which side she was on. The break came late on a Thursday night, the kind of shift that felt heavier than it should. Rain had been falling for hours, blurring the streetlights into hazy smears on the windshield as they drove back from an interview. Ryan was quieter than usual, his eyes fixed on the road in that way he had when he was turning over something in his mind. When they reached the precinct, he didn't head straight inside. Instead, he parked under the awning and sat for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. Then he turned to her. "I think I've got it," he said. "Got what?" "The link. Everything we've been circling." He didn't elaborate, just gave a small shake of his head and reached for his phone. "I need to pull some records first thing tomorrow. Once I have them, I'm going to the captain." There was a certainty in his voice she hadn't heard in weeks, the kind that meant he was ready to close the loop. She nodded, forcing her face into neutrality, but inside she felt a sharp twist of panic. That night, she didn't go home. She drove aimlessly through wet streets, the sound of the wipers keeping time with her thoughts. She ended up in the parking lot of Ethan's building, sitting there until her brother finally appeared, a hood pulled over his head, cigarette glowing in the dark. "You shouldn't be here," he said as he slid into the passenger seat. "Ryan's taking it to the captain," she told him. "Tomorrow." His jaw tightened. "Then that's it. Once it's in the system, I'm done." "You need to leave town," she said. "Tonight. Disappear before they can find you." "Disappear?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think I can just vanish? The people I work for would take that as a confession. I'd be dead before I got to the state line." She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. "Then what do you expect me to do?" "I expect you to do what you've been doing your whole life," he said quietly. "Protect me." The words landed heavy between them. She stared straight ahead, watching the rain streak down the windshield. "Laura, if Ryan brings this in, you won't just lose me. You'll lose him too. These people will make sure of it." She didn't answer. The silence stretched until Ethan opened the door and stepped out, leaving her alone in the idling car. The next morning, Ryan was at his desk early, a stack of papers in front of him and that same focused stillness in his movements. She walked past without speaking, heading to the coffee machine in the corner. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured. By mid-morning, she knew he had everything he needed. He'd been making calls, cross-checking files, and every now and then, a faint smile would pass over his face. The kind of smile that came with the satisfaction of being right. Just before lunch, he stood and slipped the thick folder under his arm. "I'm going to see the captain," he said. Her throat felt dry. "You want me to come?" "No. I'll be back in a bit." She watched him walk away, the sound of his boots fading down the hall. A minute later, she stood too, moving toward the exit without thinking. Outside, the air was damp and cool, the sky still heavy with clouds. She didn't have a plan, not exactly. Just a growing certainty that if she didn't act now, the decision would be made for her. That evening, she found herself at Ethan's again. He was pacing when she walked in, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. "You have to stop him," he said before she could speak. "I know. And not tomorrow. Not next week. Now." She sank into the couch, the cushions sagging under her. "You think it's that simple?" "I think it's the only choice you've got left." They didn't talk about how she would do it, or what it would mean. Some things didn't need to be said out loud. When she left, the streets were slick with fresh rain, the air thick with the smell of asphalt and smoke. She drove without music, without thought, her mind already narrowing to a single point. She had spent years building a career on doing the right thing, on following the line even when it blurred. But the line was gone now, swallowed by something deeper, something she couldn't walk away from without losing everything that still felt like hers. By the time she reached her apartment, she knew. The moment Ryan tried to hand over that file, it would be over, and the only way to stop him was to make sure he never got the chance. The rain returned by late afternoon, a steady curtain that blurred the city into smudges of light and shadow. Their shift had been routine up until then, nothing that hinted at the turn it was about to take. Dispatch sent them to cover a late-night stakeout on the edge of the industrial district, an address Ryan said was connected to the case, though he didn't share more than that. Laura didn't ask. Not this time. They took the unmarked car, Ryan driving. The heater hummed softly, filling the silence between them. Outside, water slid in quick streams down the glass, distorting the rows of warehouses into wavering shapes. Laura sat angled toward her window, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her mind moving in slow, deliberate loops over what she had decided. The streets grew quieter as they neared the target area. A few dim security lights glowed above locked gates, and the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement broke the stillness. Ryan parked in a shadowed stretch across from a loading dock and killed the engine, the rain drumming lightly on the roof. "We'll give it a few hours," he said, checking his watch. "See who comes and goes." She nodded, pulling her coat tighter. The interior of the car felt small, the air dense with unspoken things. For a while, they sat without speaking, their breath fogging the windows in slow bursts. Ryan sipped from his coffee thermos, eyes scanning the warehouse across the street. At some point, he leaned back in his seat, still watching. "You've been off lately," he said without looking at her. She kept her gaze on the rain-slick street. "Long couple of weeks." "More than that," he said quietly. "I don't know what's going on, but I know you. You've been holding something back." Her pulse beat hard in her ears. "We've both been holding things back." That made him glance over, his brow furrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" She met his eyes, steady. "It means you've been working a case without me. You've been keeping me out, Ryan. That's not how we work." He studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I didn't want to put you in a position. This one's messy." The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't just another case. "You mean it's about Ethan?" she said. The surprise in his face was brief, quickly replaced by a guarded stillness. "You know?" "I know enough." "Then you know I can't ignore it. He's in deep, Laura. This isn't a traffic ticket or a bad crowd. This is serious time, and worse, depending on who else decides he's a liability." Her throat felt tight. "He's my brother." "And you're my partner," Ryan said. "But we took an oath. You think I like this? You think I want to be the one to bring him in? I don't. But I can't pretend it isn't happening." She looked away, her fingers curling into her palms. "There's more than one way to end something." He shook his head. "Not this. The only way this ends is with him answering for what he's done." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against her chest. She could feel the shape of the decision sitting between them, too big to ignore now. When Ryan turned back toward the warehouse, she let her gaze drop to the space between the seats, to where her service weapon rested in its holster. The familiar weight of it was grounding, almost calming. Minutes passed. The rain eased to a mist, tapping softly on the windshield. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine coughed to life. Ryan made a note in his pad, the pen scratching quietly. She waited until his attention was fixed ahead, until the sound of his writing was the only thing in the space. Then, with a slow, steady motion, she unfastened the strap over her holster. "Ryan," she said. He glanced at her, and that was the last thing he did. The shot was muffled by the confines of the car, the flash brief, the recoil a sharp jolt up her arm. His body slumped against the driver's side door, the pen slipping from his fingers. For a moment, there was nothing but the hiss of the rain and the hollow echo of what she'd done. She stared at him, her mind strangely still, the world narrowed to the sound of her own breathing. Then she moved. Fast. She reached across him, opened his jacket, and pulled the thick folder from the inside pocket. She slipped it into her own bag without looking at its contents. Next, she shifted his body so it slumped more naturally, the kind of posture that might suggest he'd been surprised by something outside the car. From the glove compartment, she took out the backup weapon they kept there. She pressed it into his hand, curling his fingers around it just enough to leave a mark. Then she stepped out into the wet night, walked around to the driver's side, and fired 2 rounds into the dark beyond the loading dock. The sound cracked through the stillness, bouncing off the metal walls of the warehouses. Back in her seat, she called it in, her voice steady, the lie already formed. "Unit 12, officer down, ambush. Suspect fled on foot." The dispatcher's voice came back sharp and urgent, but Laura barely heard it. She was watching the rain streak down the windshield, each drop catching the light from the street lamps like fragments of glass. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the line she had crossed was one she could never return from. But the choice had been made long before the trigger was pulled. Tonight was only the moment it became real. The sirens came first, growing louder until they filled the street with sharp, urgent wails. Red and blue lights splashed against the rain-slick walls of the warehouses, painting the night in broken color. Laura stood near the rear of the unmarked car, her arms wrapped tight around herself, her breathing slow and measured. She kept her gaze low as uniformed officers rushed past, their boots splashing through shallow puddles. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders, a paramedic murmuring something she didn't fully hear. The scene was alive with motion, radios crackling, voices calling for updates, the heavy thud of more units arriving. But at the center of it all, Ryan's body remained in the driver's seat, the interior light casting a soft glow over the stillness that had replaced him. She gave her statement quickly, keeping it clean and consistent. They'd been on surveillance. A figure approached from the shadows, weapon drawn. Ryan turned, gun in hand, and the shots came almost immediately. She returned fire, but the suspect fled toward the loading dock. No, she hadn't seen a face. Yes, she was sure there was only one. She repeated the details when asked, careful not to add anything new. By the time the medical examiner's van pulled away, the scene was cordoned off with yellow tape and the captain was speaking in clipped, low tones with a pair of detectives from homicide. Laura stood apart, the blanket still draped around her, her expression set in a muted grief that felt almost natural now. The next day, the department was heavy with the news. Ryan's desk sat untouched, his chair pushed in neatly, the folder of his current case nowhere in sight. Colleagues stopped by Laura's desk, some offering quiet condolences, others just resting a hand on her shoulder before moving on. She played her part well, tired, shaken, but ready to help however she could. It didn't take long for the captain to assign someone to lead the hunt for Ryan's killer. Detective Marisol Vega was brought in, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for catching the smallest cracks in a story. She was calm, methodical, and not easily swayed by emotion. Laura greeted her with a firm handshake and the same polite cooperation she offered any colleague. Marisol began where all such cases did, the scene itself. Ballistics confirmed 2 different weapons had been fired, one matching Ryan's service gun, the other an unregistered pistol of unknown make. The shell casings from the second weapon were found near the rear of the car, as though the shooter had approached from the side. There were no usable prints, no footprints worth keeping. Laura made sure to be available whenever Marisol had questions. She walked her through the events again, took her back to the warehouse district to recreate the scene. They stood together in the drizzle, Marisol scanning the area with the quiet patience of someone who didn't need to rush. Back at the precinct, Laura overheard her speaking to the captain. Could be connected to whatever case he was working. Might have been too close to something. That possibility was already circulating among the officers. Ryan had been on to something big. That was the story everyone seemed to agree on. Laura let it grow, offering nothing to contradict it. She even suggested once, in an offhand way, that maybe the shooter had mistaken them both for someone else, a theory that sounded plausible enough to leave hanging. Days passed. Leads came in and fizzled. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed little more than shadows and passing cars. Witnesses were non-existent. The area had been too quiet, the rain keeping most indoors. The case file thickened with reports that led nowhere. Still, Marisol didn't seem frustrated. She kept combing through Ryan's records, trying to piece together his final weeks. Laura knew that was where the real danger was. She'd taken the folder, yes, but she couldn't erase every trace of his work. His emails, his notes at home, the people he'd spoken to, all of it was still out there, waiting to be connected. To maintain her position, she volunteered for every search, every interview. She wanted to be where the information was flowing, to hear it first and decide how to respond. Each night, she went home drained, not from the act she was playing, but from the constant calculation, how much to show, how much to hold back, when to push forward, and when to fade into the background. At the memorial service, she stood in the front row with the other detectives, the badge on her belt catching the light as the bagpipes played. She kept her face composed, her eyes fixed ahead. People whispered about the bond she and Ryan had shared, about how hard this must be for her. She let them believe it. But even in those quiet moments, She could feel the weight of Marisol's gaze. It wasn't accusatory, not yet. It was the steady attention of someone who collected pieces slowly, confident that the picture would reveal itself in time. Laura knew the real challenge had only just begun. Killing Ryan had been the act. Surviving the story that came after was the performance she couldn't afford to fail. The weeks that followed felt like walking across thin ice. Every step deliberate, every sound amplified in her head. On the surface, the case was stalling. Leads ran cold, witnesses stayed silent, and the rain seemed to wash away whatever traces might have been left that night. But Laura could sense that the stillness was only on the surface. Underneath, Marisol was still moving, still digging, and she didn't like not knowing where the shovel would break ground next. At her desk, Laura kept her posture relaxed, her voice steady. She asked the right questions, made herself useful, and offered to help Marisol sort through Ryan's old notes. It was the kind of gesture that looked like loyalty, but also gave her a chance to see what had been found. She sat across from Marisol in the cramped file room, thumbing through stacks of papers that smelled faintly of dust and coffee, pretending not to notice when the detective studied her over the folders. One afternoon, Marisol slid a document across the table. "This mean anything to you?" It was a list of names and numbers, some crossed out, others underlined. Near the bottom was Ethan Kane. Laura took her time looking at it, letting her brow furrow in a way that suggested curiosity but not recognition. "No," she said finally. "Should it?" "Not necessarily," Marisol replied, her tone unreadable. But Ryan thought it was important. That was the first time Laura felt a true spike of fear since the night in the car. She kept her breathing even, kept her voice neutral, but her mind was already working through the possibilities. Ryan had left more than she'd thought, and if Marisol kept following that thread, she would find Ethan. That night, Laura drove to her brother's apartment without calling first. He was at the kitchen table, beer bottle in one hand, TV flickering in the background. He looked up as she came in, reading her expression instantly. "They're looking at you," she said. He set the bottle down. "How close?" "Close enough that your name is showing up in places it shouldn't. You need to start thinking about what happens if they knock on your door." "I told you, running isn't an option." "Then make yourself small. No calls, no jobs, nothing that keeps your name moving." He smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. "You sound like you're the one in trouble." She didn't answer, just turned toward the door. "Just do what I'm telling you." Back at work, she doubled her watch on Marisol. She offered help with interviews, volunteered for errands, even brought her coffee in the mornings. She made herself part of the rhythm, the presence that was always there but never in the way. If she was close enough, maybe she could see the next move before it came. It was during one of those quiet mornings that she caught a glance at Marisol's notepad, a simple diagram, names connected by thin lines, arrows pointing toward the center. Ethan's name sat on one side, and in the middle, a bold circle around Victor Lasco. It was clear now, the focus wasn't just Ryan's killer. It was the whole network he'd been chasing. The problem was, Laura knew the only way to fully close that network was to follow the trail Ethan had left behind. And once that happened, there would be no way to steer it off course. The turning point came when Marisol called her into an interview room late one afternoon. "I want to run something by you," she said, closing the door. "We've been going through all of Ryan's calls from the last month. There's a number that comes up a lot. Belongs to a burner. We traced it to a couple of payphones in the South District." Laura felt the edges of her pulse thudding in her fingertips. And one of those payphones is across the street from your brother's shop." She kept her face still, the silence stretching just long enough to make her look thoughtful, not evasive. "That doesn't mean it's his," she said finally. "No," Marisol agreed. "But it's a start." That was the moment Laura understood how narrow her path had become. The case wasn't going to fade out quietly. It was moving toward her, step by step, and she couldn't slow it down without breaking something wide open. That night, she sat in her car outside her apartment, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. The street was quiet, the glow from the nearest lamppost pooling faintly across the hood. She thought about Ryan's voice that last night, about Ethan's smirk when he told her to protect him. She thought about Marisol, patient and steady, not rushing, not missing a thing. She realized then that survival wasn't about keeping things as they were. It was about making sure the story ended before anyone could finish writing it. And that meant she had one more choice to make. A choice that would decide whether the ice beneath her cracked all at once or held just long enough for her to reach the shore. The wind was sharp that morning, carrying a chill that cut through her coat as she crossed the precinct lot. Inside, the air felt heavy, almost expectant, like the stillness before a storm. Laura went straight to her desk, the hum of voices and phones in the background. Marisol was already in her office, blinds half drawn, speaking quietly into the phone. Laura pretended not to notice, but she could feel the change. Something had shifted. Papers were stacked differently, the whiteboard in the corner filled with new notes. The pace in the building had picked up, subtle but certain. It was the rhythm of a case gaining momentum. By mid-morning, Marisol called her in. "We've got a lead," she said simply. She slid a photo across the desk, grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to show Ethan stepping out of a nondescript sedan. He was looking over his shoulder, caught mid-motion. Pulled from a traffic camera 2 nights ago. Cars registered to a shell company tied to Lasco. "We're getting a warrant for the shop." Laura held the photo for a long moment, her fingers steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "When?" "Today. Couple of hours." She nodded, careful to keep her face neutral. "You think he knows you're coming?" "Not yet, but I don't plan to give him much time to find out." When she left Marisol's office, she didn't go back to her desk. Instead, she stepped outside, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. Ethan answered on the second ring. "Yeah. They're coming for you," she said. "Today? You've got maybe an hour before they're at the shop." Silence on the line, then a low curse. "You sure?" "Yes. Get out now." She hung up before he could say more. For a moment, she stood in the lot, the breath from her mouth hanging pale in the air. Then she walked back inside, forcing herself into the steady rhythm of the day. An hour later, Marisol and a small team rolled out toward the shop. Laura stayed behind, claiming she had follow-up work on another case. It wasn't a lie, exactly. She had work to do, just not the kind she could file in any report. She left the precinct 15 minutes later, heading in the opposite direction. Her route was deliberate, weaving through side streets until she reached a stretch of road that led to the outskirts. There, an abandoned property sat at the edge of a tree line, the kind of place no one noticed anymore. Ethan's car was already there, parked crooked in the gravel. Inside, he was pacing, jacket half-zipped, a duffel bag on the floor. "You weren't kidding," he said when he saw her. "They've got more than I thought," she replied. "You can't go home. You can't go to anyone you know. You need to disappear for real this time." "I told you that's not an option," he said, running a hand over his face. "They'll find me before I get anywhere safe. And if they don't, Lasco's people will." She closed the distance between them, her voice low. "Then you need to make it so neither of them can. You need to stop being a target." He gave her a sharp look. "And how do you suggest I do that?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Her eyes went to the duffel, clothes, cash, a gun tucked into the side pocket. She could smell the faint tang of oil and metal from it. "You think you're protecting me," he said slowly. "But every move you've made since this started has just been buying time. Time runs out, Laura. It always does." She stepped back, her mind turning over the truth in his words. The time she had been buying wasn't for him anymore. It was for herself. Every hour he was still out, there was another hour she could keep her own name from coming up in the wrong conversations. The sound of an engine in the distance broke her thoughts. She moved to the window, saw nothing yet, but she knew the shape of what was coming. Whether it was Marisol's team or someone else didn't matter. The end was arriving. Ethan came to stand beside her. "If it's them," he said, "you need to walk away now. Pretend you never made this call." She looked at him, taking in the lines of his face, the shadow in his eyes. "It's too late for that." He opened his mouth to speak, but whatever words he had were cut off by the sound of tires on gravel. Closer now, more than one vehicle. Laura turned toward him, the weight of the last months pressing in all at once. "I can't let them take you," she said. "What are you?" The gun was in her hand before he finished, the movement smooth, almost practiced. One shot, then another, each one landing where she aimed. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock, then collapsed onto the floor beside the duffel. The room was silent again, except for the sound of her breathing. She crouched, unzipped the bag, and pulled out the cash. the gun she left, placing it loosely in his hand. By the time the vehicle stopped outside, she was gone out the back, slipping into the tree line. The cold bit at her skin, the weight of the money heavy against her side. She didn't look back. She knew what they would find, a man with a record, tied to Lasco, armed and ready when the law came. They would see the obvious story, the one that didn't include her. And for now, that would be enough. But as she moved deeper into the shadows, she understood that every choice she'd made had only delayed the inevitable. The ice might hold for a while longer, but cracks were already spreading beneath her feet. And when it gave way, she would be too far from shore to swim back.